So lately, Spirit Team has been bugging me to have me share with you who my mentor is. And I would like to introduce to you everyone, this is Linda Lightfoot. Linda Lightfoot is my mentor from way back when, 2001, who got me started on this path. The unfortunate part of the story is that Linda is no longer with us. She crossed over deep in the winter of 2012, 2013. But even though she's not here physically with us anymore, I will say she is very much here with us spiritually, energetically, definitely. She hangs out with me off and on, and has helped me out over the years on the other side. But I wanted to introduce to you and share with you the person who was responsible for planting the seeds that eventually became where I have landed today. And when I met her, she basically took me under her wings. And there are so many great Linda Lightfoot stories that I have to share. And so many of them are just filled with so much joy and so much laughter and so much spiritual irreverence. We had so much fun together talking and working with this whole idea of spirituality. But the one story that I want to bring up with you today is my spiritual inception story with Linda, which is, it's actually kind of funny. So here it is. So it was 2001, and I was working downtown Fort Collins, Colorado, 7th floor Key Bank building, up on the 7th floor looking out over the Eastern Plains. I was working at an independent insurance agency, and this agency decided that we need to hire an in-house accountant, and so they interviewed and they hired Linda. And Linda moved in across the cubicle from mine, so we were like next door neighbors in the office, and we started chit-chatting like, you do in an office. We started chit-chatting, and it was warm and friendly enough that at the time, I was doing, I was coming off a, journalism major, creative writing, poetry, journaling, my first love is writing. And so at a point into the beginning of our friendship, I said, "Hey, Linda, would you like to read some of my writing, like my top 10 poetry pieces?" And she was like, "Of course, I'd love to take a look at them." So brought them in, handed them off to her. She took them home, took a couple of days. And then I approached her one day and I was like, "Hey, so did you have a chance to read what I wrote, and what did you think?" And so she got a funny look on her face. And that's what she said to me. She said, "Dana, I don't think what you're doing is creative writing." And I'm like, "Well, Linda, if it's not creative writing, what is it?" And she's like, "Well, honey, I think what you're doing is actually something called channeling." And I'd never heard of channeling. That was the last thing I thought she would say to me. And so I was kind of like, "Well, what's channeling?" And she was like, "Well, honey, I think you better go look that up on the internet." She was, Linda was so wise about, she'd plant a seed and get real coy, and then she'd walk away. When I had this conversation with her, I was in her cubicle, and it was like one of those comic strip moments. I was like, beep, pew, and I zoomed around out of her cubicle into my cubicle, and there was like, puff of dust, puff of smoke in her space, zoomed into my cubicle, slid into my chair, swished up to my computer terminal, and Web 1.0, because we're doing Web 1.0 and flip phones. And so Web 1.0, and I typed in and I looked up channeling. And I did one of those things where you zoom in and then you lean in and then you lean back. It was like, whoop and woo. And so what came up on the computer screen was, somebody channeling angels, and somebody channeling ascended masters, and somebody channeling ETs, and somebody channeling fairies and gnomes and elves. And it was a bit much. And, Linda had this thing of like, once she planted the seed, she gave you room to kind of soak up what you were taking in, and that's what she did. She let me take it in. She didn't crowd me too much, and then that began our spiritual conversations. Now, what's really interesting is that whole interaction and then us continuing to chit chat at work a little bit as much as you can with, the ears around. So we had kind of continued that conversation a little bit at work. And then in the middle of this, 9/11 happened. I walked into the office one day and everybody's standing around the TV in the conference room, and the footage of the Twin Towers coming down was going on. It was so upsetting and so intense. And those of us who lived through it, we will never forget that. We will never forget what happened. And I truly believe that as I watched those Twin Towers come down, I truly believe there was something going on in my body where, from feet onward up, I felt something boot up in my body. I didn't know what it was at the time, but, the time I've had to review it and go over it, I definitely know that watching those Twin Towers come down activated something in my body, and all of a sudden, like it was, and I'm pretty sure that's where my awakening began to happen, and my psychic lights beginning to turn on, and me having a sense of I'm here for so much more than being a widget in the system and paying bills and all of that. And so that day that 9/11 happened, we got let go from work early that day, and Linda and I, we decided to use that extra time that we were given that day to go do something meaningful. And so our meaningful thing was to get together and deepen our conversation about what this thing was about channeling and what spirituality was. And so we started our tradition that afternoon. I went and picked up calzones from Old Chicago's and zoomed over to Linda's place and sat down in her back patio area, and we had our meal and started talking. We basically started talking about philosophy and religion and belief systems and what's a spirituality thing and what's channeling and what's higher power. And we really dove deep into the deep end of the pool, and that started our conversations and our tradition. And it wasn't every Thursday night, but it was fairly frequent Thursday nights from then on out that Linda and I would get together and talk shop. And it's from those moments of connection where she began teaching me about how to ground out and get present in my body, how to set space, how to open up energy space, how to call in spirit, how to begin to know channeling. Like, I didn't even know what a psychic reading was. Like, that is a whole story in of itself that is just hilarious. But that's where Linda taught me the basics, and she passed on her legacy to me. And she had been a part of women's circles where they had passed on their legacy to her. So it's this whole verbal legacy of spirituality that we were passing on to one another. Now, what you need to know is, like, today it is very easy to get on social media and view any number of people talking about spirituality and their experiences and teachings and all of this. And what you got to know is, back in 2001, running into another spiritual person who was working their system basically was like the rarity of a blue moon happening. Like, in Linda's life up to that point, she had only met a couple people. And in my life up to that point, I had only met her. There were not very many of us. The internet was rudimentary. I told you what I saw. And then the other resources were to, like, go to a bookshop or go to the library, or find a metaphysical shop or a small group. The groups were very few, far between, and very, very small. So, like, resources to develop your spirituality were scant at the time. Nothing like the full-fledged resources that we have today. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, for Linda and I to find one another and begin those conversations was a miracle. It was a miracle inside of a miracle. so rare, so amazing.